Nous accueillons maintenant Miriam Adelman,
going
qui
to
est
welcome
professeure
Miriam
de sociologie
Adelman.
à
She's a
l'Université fédérale de
sociology
Paraná au
professor
Brésil.
in the
Depuis
Paraná
1992.
University in Brazil, and this
Et
is
après
since
des études au
1992.
Mexique,
After having
à New
studied
York
in
et
Mexico,
au
in
Brésil,
New York, and in
elle effectue
Brazil,
actuellement des
she's
recherches
currently doing
sur le domaine du
research
genre et des pratiques équestres.
in the field of gender and
Donc, la présentation
equestrian
qui nous est
practices. The
proposée
presentation
s'intitule Femmes,
is called
loisirs,
Women,
activités équestres populaires au
Leisure
Brésil,
and
deux points,
Equestrian
un moyen
Activities.
d'émancipation, point d'interrogation.
Is it an empowerment, a means of empowerment for women?
First of all, I would like to thank Savine because she invited me to this event. Also to Reese because it was through his equestrian research network that I found out about, that I got on the mailing list. And thank all of the people who are in one way or another made this event possible, because I know there's a big team always to take care, to do something like this. So it's a great pleasure. I've got a lot of material, so I'm going to have to try to hurry and not get sidetracked, which I have a talent for. So, okay, women, leisure, and popular equestrian sport in Brazil, paths to empowerment. Okay. Now, I've been doing research on women, particularly women gender relations in the equestrian world for 15 years. I myself am a gender studies, culture studies sociologist, social scientist. I'm going to show you a little bit of that research and concentrate on one particular case, which is my most recent research. Now, Brazil, like most other Latin American countries, or probably all, has a long, rich history of equestrian culture and practice. Horses have been important in cattle ranching, as farm animals, as beasts of burden, and as means of transportation. Also, for military use, in the Brazilian case, until very recently, show jumping was very much linked to the military, even more than to the leisure of the social elites. The turf, which was very important, it's been referred to as the first modern sport in Brazil, has, during the latter part of the 20th century, seems to have lost its appeal as a spectator sport. And in fact, nowadays, betting, which is still attracts a lot of attention and is a common practice, most of it occurs off track. On the other hand, there's growing middle-class interest in riding and in equine tourism, equestrian tourism, as evidenced in Brazilian equestrian publications. There is a flourishing horse industry which is trying very hard to stimulate this demand, together with growing interests in a variety of forms of what is called ecotourism, ecological tourism. And in contrast to the turf, perhaps we could say that popular equestrian traditions, and there are many of them in Brazil, which I won't be able to go into here, but one of them, the rodeo that I'm studying now, these popular equestrian traditions are not on the decline. And I believe that they've just taken on a new form. So one of my research hypotheses says that rodeo has an important new role to play in the new ruralities, which in Brazilian rural sociology is a topic that a lot is being done on, okay? Now, one overwhelming common characteristic of all spheres of equestrian practice in Brazil today echoes what has been seen around the world. More women and girls are involved in all different levels. Although I have to say I cheated because I took this photo in Argentina. But it's really got the same spirit. And since I think it could have been taken in Brazil, and it shows these two wonderful girls riding out in the countryside, I stuck it in here. It's Southern American culture anyway, okay? Now here you see a Brazilian, one of the 3 or 4 horse publications in Brazil, and this means the pleasures of trail riding, okay? And there's also, the picture up in the other corner there is a young woman in a show, in a jumping competition. But what's interesting is the fact that she's wearing the red breeches that show that she is actually a student at the military college. All the kids at the military college wear these red breeches. And why is that important? Well, because until very recently, the only people who could really partake in show jumping in Brazil were members of the upper classes. Brazil, as you probably are all aware of, is a country that is probably one of the most unequal in the world, in the sense that there are a fair amount of rich people, and there's a lot of wealth really concentrated, and many, many poor, something that's changing a little bit, but can't go into that. So what's different here is that now, since girls began to began to be accepted in military college, sometimes we see poor boys and girls from poorer backgrounds participating in show jumping. Not in great numbers, but symbolically, I think it's important. And symbolically, the fact is that they are marked by the fact that they're wearing red breeches and not the beautiful white and beige ones that the rich kids wear. But, you know, that's just one more evidence of some of the contradictions that are always present in moments of change. And at the bottom, we have a girl who's participating in barrel racing competition. Okay. This quote here is from a friend of mine who is a sports historian, Silvana, and she is just talking about women's sport and physical culture, what it meant in the early 20th century. It's a quote that I like because I think in kind of a nutshell it brings to you a little bit of the spirit of some of my research on women in equestrian sport. So she says, excessive perspiration, physical effort, strong emotions, competition, consensual rivalry, firm muscles, bodily gestures as spectacle, freedom of movement, light clothing, and semi-nudity, all common practices within the universe of physical culture, awoke suspicion when applied to women because they seemed to break down certain barriers around the ideal image of femininity. Furthermore, they seemed to destabilize a terrain that had been created and maintained under male authority as justified by the biology of the body and of sex, and which was supposed to render proof of men's superiority over women. Which brings us to the question of the challenge, the possibility of women and girls' empowerment through equestrian sport. Now, more recently, I've been looking at some of the literature, the sociological literature on leisure and on gender and leisure. And so I bring here 4 points that I think are relevant for my research. First of all, that the literature has documented the ways in which, in our cultures, women and men tend to be differently entitled to leisure, okay? The benefiting men. I also work with the queer theorist Eve Kosofsky-Cedric's concept of homosociality when I take a look at male sporting and leisure culture. So homosociality, the way modernity created the modern public sphere as a sphere of relations, basically, between men and excluding women. In my own research, which is participant observation, ethnographic, I tend then to take a look also at how men and women interact within the equestrian fields that I study, and I also try to adopt an intersectional perspective, which means always looking for how class and gender and race and sexual orientation, etc., generation also intersect. And then I also have been trying to capture issues regarding women's sporting cultures, which would sort of, well, to see to what extent they respond perhaps to historic culture, homosocial cultures, and also the question of women and adventure, perhaps if historically it's been harder for women to see themselves as adventurous, I think the equestrian world has also historically offered women a connection to a culture of adventure. So these are things that interest me, and I'm just really skimming through all of it because I want to get to the end of this before my 15 minutes are up. Okay, then recently I've started researching the rodeo world. There's a particular rodeo culture in the southern part of Brazil which has something in common with rodeos in Argentina, Chile, but has strong also regional specificities. And it's funny, the first quote you see here, however, is actually from a North American woman. And I copied it here because this was something that influenced me. I think it inspired me to start researching rodeo world in Brazil. So I actually saw this quote once when I was in the United States, and I went to a barn to ride, and there was a photo of about 30 women who were cowgirls, and it was an old photo, let's say the early 20th century. And so the emancipation of women may have begun not with the vote, nor in the cities where women marched and carried signs and protested, but rather when they mounted a good cow horse and realized how different and fine the view. From the back of a horse, the world looked wider. And then the second quote, which is from maybe the one book that I have found thus far in Brazil, specifically talking about women and horses. Actually, I realized when I was going over my notes today that it's incomplete here. It makes reference to a historic figure, Anita Garibaldi, who was a 19th century woman, a heroine, soldier, somebody who went off to battle together with her husband. And the rest of the quote, which for some reason I just left out when I was preparing the slides, talks about how these women today who are part of this rodeo tradition and see her as their inspiration, follow her example in dressing, not the way women historically dressed, but as men wearing this particular pantaloon, which I will show you, and taking part in non-traditional activities, whatever. Okay, so we'll go back to the rodeo in a second, but here again, I'm just trying to summarize some of the theories. So I'm working with the question of to what extent these rodeo activities take girls and women behind boundaries and binaries, beyond the boundaries and binaries of gender, the masculine and the feminine, male and female. So this brings in some discussions of rural and urban life, and also how perhaps nowadays even the division between rural and urban are not clear. And this is the case for Brazil, as it is for most of the world. Then prendas y peões, these are two terms. You'll see an illustration of this in a second. The peões would be peons, and the prendas are particular signification of what it means to be a woman in a particular way of reinventing Brazilian cultural history, which you'll see in a second. Okay? Then fazendeiros or peões, that would be the rich landowners or the peons, gringos or Brazilians. So whose traditions are we talking about today? Okay. So everybody must have heard of the gaucho or the gaúcho, as they say in Brazil, historic figure from Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. And the gaucho is always signified in the masculine. So it's emblematically male, and an identity that embodies the notion of brave and heroic men who take on the challenges of the frontier. I do believe that there is an invisibilized history of women who not only Anita Garibaldi, but many others who one way or another did participate in these activities. But in order to go further with that, I need to start working with people who are also historians, so haven't done that yet. Okay, let me try to be really quick. Okay, when I talk about reinventing tradition, this is what I'm referring to. This is a recent image, but you see the peon and the prenda. So then you'll see what has become, fortunately, of this image of the prenda today. Okay, here are some of today's prendas. This is material from our field research, so we've asked if growing female participation reconfigures practices and expands cultural notions of masculine and feminine, and how, and are new ways, other ways, different ways of being women being constituted. And yes, I do believe so. I should say that women's participation in this rodeo competition in southern Brazil is really recent. It began in the 1990s and really became much more a mass phenomena only in around the year 2000. So we're privileged in doing research on something so recent changes. This is a photograph that I took. Okay. These guys asked me to take their picture. They begged me, and I was really happy because I wouldn't have had the guts to do it otherwise. But this is a little bit of that homosociality, which is still very characteristic of the rodeo world. So women and girls could feel uncomfortable in the environment, and sometimes still do. Okay, now here, I guess I'm going to let you read these very quickly, because otherwise we won't have time. So I show some of the changing attitudes. All of our respondents talked about how men, little by little, are beginning to accept women's participation and girls' participation. Now, we've recently begun to interview and talk to more men about how they feel about women participating. And I'm just going to read the second quote because I think it's so absolutely fantastic. Now, this guy is a worker of rural origin, 44 years old, who's been involved with horses all his life. And he said, "Our daughters are always around, so they come with us to the rodeo for the Sunday meal, and they say things like, 'Dad, I want to ride a horse too.' And in the beginning you find it annoying. You say, 'No, no, no.' But then when your daughter comes running up to you and says, 'Dad, I roped my calf,' you say, 'You did, sweetie?' And she replies, 'Yeah.' Then they all start showing up and wanting to rope, and it's so moving to see the family there and the daughter roping. So the dad then gives in. Things are getting equal, almost equal, and that's the way I want it, because before I was the only one supporting the family, and now my wife is pitching in. So much that many of us guys are afraid of this, because just look, we have a woman president. Women are almost taking over. They're really showing their ability, and they're right. There's nothing wrong with that." Okay. Now, in the one thing that we have also seen is that there's a discourse that's very common amongst people in the rodeo. They say, yes, we actually like it, men will say, when our daughters or our girlfriends or our wives participate, because the rodeo is one of the rare places that you can find today for family recreation, family leisure, and people will make reference to some of the dangers outside, such as children and young people who start experimenting with drugs, and they'll talk about sexually transmitted diseases, and they see the rodeo as some kind of a safe place where all of these dangers can be avoided, which of course is not really the case at all, but this is what my research assistants and I heard over and over again when we asked people about how they saw the environment there. And some of the things that we're looking at now are to what extent there is real gender bending, to what extent there are transgressions of heteronormativity going on in this rodeo environment. Lots of contradictions there, which if there's time you can ask me about it and I can talk about. No time now. Then we also get a bit of this apologetics of femininity that gender studies in sports sociologists have talked about. That is that when women get involved in sports, they're often asked to excuse themselves and say, yes, I'm an athlete, but I'm still a woman. I haven't lost my femininity. So these are areas where we see a lot of policing and of boundaries, and it came up in our research a lot, as you can see here by this quote, which I'm also not going to read. Okay, this is also a nice one, just shows the degree of passion that women have invested in their participation in the rodeo. Then I have some work here on the iconography of the rodeo world, but no time for that now, so I'm just going to flash really quickly through these photos from a magazine, Rodeo World magazine in Brazil. Okay, getting to the end. And then I summarize this research and some of the other research I've been doing by starting to think about the values that are involved in equestrian sport and leisure, and trying to think about a politics of equestrian sport and leisure, because I do believe, as in any other domain of social life, there is one. So some of the issues that some of the questions that I ask have to do with whether or not equestrian sport and leisure promote democracy, or do they tend to sustain social hierarchies? The gender issues, which I've shown you here, class and race issues, which I haven't gotten into much, but I do in my research and I believe are important, rural-urban connections, the question of nature and ecology that the other presenters have spoken about today, and finally, a question of whether in equestrian sport and leisure, people and animals are put before profit, if that is possible, under the conditions in which we live, okay? And that's it, and here's my research team, myself, a few of my students without whose help I would not have been able to do this research, and just another image from my research, which I love, so we'll end on, you can take a look and analyze the iconography yourselves. Okay, thank you.